At some point in your life, maybe recently, maybe years ago, maybe in a quiet moment just like this one, you may have looked up from everything you were doing and felt something that had no clean name. Not sadness exactly, not anxiety in the way that word is usually used, something closer to a kind of disorientation, a feeling of moving through your own life without quite being inside it, of doing all the right things, working, relating, achieving, maintaining, and still feeling, somewhere beneath all of it, genuinely lost. Not lost in the way that as a map has its solution, lost in a deeper sense, lost from yourself. And the frightening part, the part that most people never say out loud, is that this feeling doesn't always arrive during the hard times. Sometimes it arrives precisely when things are going well, when you've reached the goal, built the relationship, earned the stability, created the life that was supposed to feel like arrival. And instead of arrival, what you feel is the quiet, bewildering question rising up from somewhere beneath the surface. Is this it? Is this who I am? Is this what I actually wanted? If that question is familiar to you, what follows may offer something more valuable than answers. It may offer a framework, a way of understanding why that feeling of lostness exists, where it actually comes from, what it is trying to tell you, and what it might mean to begin finding your way back. Not back to some idealized version of yourself, but back to yourself as you actually are. Dr. Gabor Maté has spent decades working with people at the furthest edges of human suffering, people struggling with addiction, with chronic illness, with profound mental and emotional pain. And across all of that work, across all the diversity of circumstance and story and struggle, one theme has emerged with striking consistency. The people who suffer most are not always the ones who experience the most dramatic trauma. They are often the ones who lost connection, early, quietly, gradually, with their own authentic selves, with their own emotional truth, with the internal compass that when it is functioning tells you not just what to do, but who you actually are beneath everything you do. Gabor Maté calls this the tension between two fundamental human needs: the need for authenticity, knowing what you feel, expressing what you need, living in alignment with your genuine inner experience, and the need for attachment, belonging, connection, being loved and accepted by the people who matter to you. In an ideal world, these two needs support each other. You're fully yourself and fully loved at the same time. Your authenticity deepens your connections rather than threatening them. But for many people, perhaps for most people, to varying degrees, these two needs came into conflict early in life. And that conflict, and the way it was resolved, is the origin of the feeling of lostness that so many adults carry without fully understanding where it came from. Here's what that conflict looked like in practice. You were a child. You had feelings, vivid, urgent, entirely real feelings. Anger, sadness, fear, longing, the full, unedited emotional life of a developing human being encountering the world for the first time. And those feelings needed to go somewhere. They needed to be expressed and received, not necessarily solved. A child doesn't need a parent who fixes every difficult feeling, but witnessed, acknowledged, met with genuine presence, with the simple, profoundly important message: I see what you're feeling. It makes sense. You are not alone in it. But perhaps that wasn't consistently available. Perhaps the parent was emotionally overwhelmed, stretched thin by their own struggles, their own history, their own unprocessed pain. Perhaps certain emotions made them uncomfortable. Perhaps sadness triggered their anxiety, or anger triggered their own unresolved anger, or need triggered their sense of inadequacy. Perhaps they were present physically, but absent in the way that actually matters, the emotional way, the way that registers in the developing child's nervous system, not as safety, but as a kind of ambient uncertainty. And so the child, your younger self, faced an impossible choice, not a conscious one. Children don't reason their way through this, but the nervous system registers it with perfect precision. When I expressed what I actually feel, something in this connection becomes less stable. When I am fully myself, the person I need most becomes less available. And so authenticity was sacrificed, not all at once, gradually, in small, imperceptible adjustments. The child learned which emotions were welcome and which were not, learned which version of themselves maintained the connection and which version disrupted it, learned to monitor the emotional climate of the room before checking in with their own inner weather. And with each adjustment, the distance between who the child actually was and who they learned to be grew slightly wider, so slowly that no one noticed, so gradually that it never felt like a loss. Until one day, years later, decades later, an adult looks up from their life and feels lost and cannot understand why. This is not a small insight. Sit with it for a moment. The feeling of lostness that many adults experience, the sense of not knowing who they are, what they want, what actually matters to them beneath the roles and the obligations and the performed versions of themselves, is not a sign of weakness. It is not ingratitude. It is not a midlife cliche or an existential indulgence. It is the accumulated distance between the self that learned to survive and the self that was never fully allowed to live. And according to Gabor Maté's framework, this distance is one of the most significant sources of human suffering. Not because it is dramatic, but precisely because it isn't, because it is quiet, because it operates beneath the surface of functional, apparently normal lives, because it can coexist with success, with relationship, with all the external markers of a life that is working, and still hollow everything out from the inside. One of the most painful aspects of this particular form of lostness is how invisible it is. When you are suffering from something obvious, a loss, an illness, a crisis, the world around you is the framework for your pain. People understand. They offer support. The suffering is a name and a context. But when you feel lost in this quieter, more diffuse way, when you feel like a stranger in your own life, despite having done nothing obviously wrong, there's often no framework available. And in the absence of a framework, many people reach for the most available explanation. Something is wrong with me. I am not grateful enough. I am not trying hard enough. I am broken in some way that other people are not. This conclusion is almost never accurate, but it is almost always painful. And it sends people searching for solutions in directions that cannot address the actual problem. More achievement, more productivity, more optimization, more distraction, more of whatever temporarily fills the hollow feeling without ever touching what created it. So what actually created it? And more importantly, what does finding yourself again actually look like? Gabor Mate's work offers something that is both simpler and more demanding than most popular answers to these questions. It begins with a concept that sounds almost too straightforward to carry the weight it actually carries: the return to the authentic self, not as a destination, not as a dramatic reinvention, but as a daily, ongoing, imperfect practice of honest contact with your own inner experience. What does that mean in practical terms? It means learning to ask and genuinely attempting to answer questions that many people have spent years avoiding. Not because they are unanswerable, but because the answers can feel threatening. Questions like, what do I actually feel right now beneath what I think I should feel? What do I actually need beneath what I think I'm supposed to need? What would I choose if I weren't choosing based on who I'm afraid to disappoint? These questions sound simple. They are not simple. For someone who learned early in life that their authentic inner experience was not welcome, who learned to suppress, redirect, and perform rather than feel and express, these questions can produce genuine disorientation. The inner landscape that most people assume is always accessible turns out to be, for many people, surprisingly unfamiliar territory. And this is where one of the most important insights in Gabor Mate's body of work becomes relevant. The journey back to yourself is not primarily intellectual. It is not solved by reading the right book, or finding the right framework, or achieving enough self awareness to think your way out of the problem. It is fundamentally a felt experience. It happens in the body, in the nervous system, in the slow, gradual, often uncomfortable process of learning to be present with your own inner life without immediately managing, suppressing, or escaping it. Many people who feel lost describe a particular experience that is worth naming directly because it is so common and so rarely discussed. They describe a sense of performing their own life, of going through the motions of choices that feel like they belong to someone else, the responsible version, the expected version, the version that makes sense to everyone around them, the career that was chosen for its safety rather than its meaning, the relationship dynamic that was settled for because real intimacy felt too exposed, the carefully maintained image of having it together that cost an extraordinary amount of energy to sustain and yields in the quiet moments a loneliness that is almost impossible to explain. This experience of performing your own life is not pretension. It is not dishonesty in the moral sense. It is what happens when the gap between the authentic self and the adaptive self becomes wide enough that the adaptive self, the version that was built for survival, becomes the only self the person knows how to inhabit. Gabor Maté often emphasizes that this gap is not unique to people with dramatic trauma histories. It is, in varying degrees, a nearly universal human experience in modern culture. A culture that consistently rewards performance over authenticity, that values productivity over presence, that teaches people, often beginning in childhood, continuing through school, consolidating in professional life, that their worth is determined by what they produce, how they appear, how efficiently they manage themselves and their emotions. In this cultural context, the authentic self, the one that knows what it feels, that needs what it needs, that sometimes wants to rest or grieve or be uncertain or simply exist without justification, is not celebrated. It is, at best, tolerated in private. At worst, it is pathologized, labeled as weakness, instability, sensitivity, dysfunction. And so people learn to leave it behind, long before they realize what they've left. There is a question that surfaces frequently in this territory, and it deserves an honest answer. Is it too late? The question usually comes from adults who have lived significant portions of their lives shaped by these patterns, who have spent years, sometimes entire careers, entire relationships, entire chapters of their lives operating from the adaptive self rather than the authentic one, who look at the distance between where they are and where they sense they could have been and feel not just lost, but behind, as though the window for something different has already closed. The title of this video touches on this fear directly. We learn it too late. And there is real grief in that phrase. Grief that deserves acknowledgement rather than dismissal. Yes, there is genuine loss in recognizing these patterns later in life. There is grief for the years of self-suppression, for the choices made from fear rather than genuine desire, for the relationships that were structured around your adaptive self rather than your authentic one, for the time spent becoming someone else's idea of who you should be while your actual self waited quietly for permission to exist. That grief is real, and it should not be rushed past. But grief, as Gabor Maté's work consistently illustrates, is not the same as foreclosure. Feeling the loss of something does not mean the possibility is permanently gone. In fact, the capacity to grieve, to actually feel the weight of what was lost rather than defending against it, is itself a sign of returning authenticity. Because grief requires contact with your own inner reality. It requires presence with what is true rather than what is manageable. And from that grief, when it is fully felt rather than bypassed, something else often becomes possible. Not a return to the past, not the recovery of the years that were spent differently, but a different relationship to the time that remains, a different quality of presence in a life that is still happening. Gabor Mate's work does not promise that healing is fast or linear or complete, but it does insist, through decades of clinical observation and personal reflection, that awareness is genuinely transformative. That the moment you begin to understand why you feel what you feel, why you do what you do, why the patterns that seem so irrational from the outside make perfect sense given what your nervous system learned in the first years of your life, that moment changes something. Not everything, but something real, something that compounds. So, what are the first honest steps? What does moving toward yourself actually look like in the ordinary texture of daily life? It looks like pausing when you are about to say yes to something and asking whether the yes comes from genuine desire or from fear of disappointing someone. It looks like noticing when you feel an emotion rise up, the impulse to immediately suppress it or explain it away, and choosing sometimes to simply let it be felt for a moment longer. It looks like sitting with discomfort without immediately reaching for the thing that makes the discomfort stop, not because discomfort is valuable in itself, but because the things that make it stop are often the same things that have been keeping you from yourself. It looks like beginning to distinguish between what you actually think and what you've absorbed as the expected or acceptable thought, between what you actually want and what you've decided you should want, between the voice that is genuinely yours and the accumulated voices of everyone whose approval shaped you. This is slow work. It is not a weekend workshop. It is not a realization that reorganizes everything in a single moment. It is a practice, daily, imperfect, sometimes frustrating, sometimes quietly revelatory. The practice of bringing honest attention to your own inner experience and gradually, very gradually, learning to trust what you find there. Psychologists who work in a trauma-informed tradition, building on frameworks like those Gabor Maté has developed and articulated, consistently observe that this practice, this slow return to authentic self-awareness, has effects that extend far beyond the individual. When a person begins to reconnect with their own emotional truth, their relationships change. Not because they are trying to change them, but because they are showing up differently, more honestly, more presently, less from the adaptive performance and more from genuine contact with who they actually are. And that shift, quiet as it often is, changes the quality of everything it touches. There's one more thing that deserves to be said, perhaps the most important thing. The feeling of being lost, the one that brought you to this conversation, whether you recognized it by that name or not, is not a sign that something is fundamentally wrong with you. It is not evidence of a defective self. It is not proof that you have failed at the project of being a person. It is in many ways a signal from the authentic self that has been waiting, sometimes for decades, for conditions safe enough to make itself known. The lostness is the authentic self knocking, saying, I am still here. I have been here the whole time. I am asking, in the only language available to me, for you to come back. The question is not whether you can find your way back. According to everything Gabor Mate's work points toward, the answer to that question is almost always yes. The question is whether you are willing to begin, willing to look honestly at the patterns that have shaped you without condemning yourself for having them, willing to feel what has gone unfelt, willing to need what you have denied needing, willing to be imperfectly and honestly and without the protection of the adaptive self, simply who you are. That willingness, uncertain, vulnerable, often terrifying, is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the beginning of everything. Not everything, not instant transformation, not a life suddenly free of difficulty or confusion or pain, but the beginning of a different quality of relationship with your own existence, one in which you are no longer a stranger to yourself, one in which the question of who you are and what you want becomes less frightening and more interesting, one in which the feeling of moving through your own life without quite being inside it, gradually, imperfectly, non linearly, but genuinely begins to shift. Healing rarely announces itself, it tends to arrive quietly, in small moments of honest feeling, in the pause before the automatic response, in the choice made once and then again to tell the truth to yourself first and then perhaps to others about what your inner experience actually is. As Gabor Mate's work reminds us again and again, with extraordinary consistency and compassion, we are not broken, we are adapted. And what was adapted in the service of survival can, with awareness and courage and time, be gently, honestly, unmade. Not to leave you with nothing, but to make room for something real. If this conversation touched something in you, if something here felt true in a way that's difficult to articulate, take a moment with that, sit with it. You don't need to resolve it immediately. If you'd like to continue the conversation, share your thoughts in the comments. What resonated most? What question are you sitting with now? And if these kinds of deep, honest explorations of psychology and the human experience feel meaningful to you, consider subscribing. There is much more ahead. Because understanding yourself honestly, compassionately, without the rush to fix or perform or conclude, is some of the most worthwhile work there is.